The night was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of stillness that settled deep in the bones, making every rustle of wind sound like an impending threat. Officer Daniel Mercer had patrolled these streets for years, but something about this shift felt wrong. The radio crackled, slicing through the eerie silence. Unit 12, we have a 911 call from 417 Oak Hollow Road. Child's voice, repeated cries for help. No response from callback. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Oak Hollow Road was deep on the outskirts of town, a stretch of land known for abandoned homes and forgotten pasts. As far as he knew, 417 had been empty for nearly a decade. The dispatcher's voice held an edge of uncertainty. Proceed with caution. He flicked on his siren, though no one was around to hear it. The drive took longer than expected, the roads narrowing, trees pressing in from both sides like silent watchers. A dense fog coiled around his cruiser, thickening with each passing mile. By the time he reached the address, his headlights barely cut through the haze. The house stood in isolation, a skeletal structure with boarded-up windows and a front door that sagged from years of neglect. Its exterior was weather-worn, the peeling paint and rotted wood evidence of something long abandoned. Yet, from somewhere inside, the sound of faint, desperate sobbing reached his ears. A child. He stepped out, boots crunching against dead leaves and brittle twigs. The sobs came again, closer this time, barely above a whisper. "Please, help me." Daniel hesitated, an unnatural chill running down his spine. Something wasn't right. He pressed the radio. "Dispatch, I've arrived at 417 Oak Hollow. There's definitely someone inside, requesting backup." Static. Dispatch? Nothing. A deep, gnawing unease settled in his gut, but duty outweighed fear. He unholstered his flashlight and approached the door. It creaked open before he even touched it, revealing a gaping darkness within. The air inside was thick with decay, a mix of mildew and something fouler, something coppery. His flashlight beam trembled as it swept across the walls. Torn wallpaper curled at the edges, and old furniture stood frozen in time, draped in thick layers of dust. Then, movement. A shadow darted at the top of the staircase. Small, quick. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. A child? "Police?" he called out, his voice steady despite the tension curling in his chest. "I'm here to help. Where are you?" A muffled sob came from upstairs. He ascended cautiously, each step groaning beneath his weight. The hallway at the top was lined with doors, all slightly ajar. His flashlight cut through the blackness, illuminating faded family portraits. The faces were indistinct, their eyes smudged as if something had deliberately erased them. "Help me." The voice drifted from the last room on the right. Daniel's breath hitched. He pushed the door open. Inside, the air was colder. A small figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the dim glow of his light. A little girl, no older than 6, her tangled hair covering most of her face. She wore a tattered nightgown, her bare feet dirty against the wooden floor. Daniel crouched slightly, lowering his weapon. "Hey there," he said gently. "It's okay. I'm here now. Can you tell me your name?" She didn't respond. Her thin shoulders trembled. "Are you alone?" he pressed. Finally, she lifted her head, and Daniel's blood ran ice cold. Her eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto his. Her mouth parted, but the voice that came wasn't hers. "You shouldn't have come." A force unseen hurled him backward. He slammed into the wall with bone-rattling force, his flashlight skidding across the floor. The shadows in the room thickened, twisting, crawling toward him. The girl's form began to distort, her limbs lengthening unnaturally, her neck snapping at an impossible angle. The sound of bones popping filled the space. Daniel struggled to move, but something held him down. Whispers slithered through the air, indecipherable yet deafening. The walls seemed to close in, shifting, changing. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The house was silent once more. The girl was gone. Daniel gasped for breath, pushing himself up. His radio crackled back to life. Unit 12, do you copy? Backup is en route. Do you require assistance? His hands were shaking. He forced himself to his feet, eyes darting around the now empty room. He staggered toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the whispers returned, now directly behind him. You let it out. A child's giggle echoed in the hallway. The door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed him whole. Gah. Part 2. Trapped in the darkness. The door slammed shut with such force that the entire room trembled. Officer Daniel Mercer barely had time to react before the darkness swallowed him whole. The air turned thick and heavy, pressing against his chest like an unseen weight. His flashlight. He scrambled for it, fingers brushing against the cold wooden floor until they wrapped around the handle. He flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the suffocating blackness. Then came the whisper. You let it out. The voice was no longer just behind him. It was all around him, seeping from the walls, curling in his ears. His breath hitched as a child's giggle echoed from the hallway beyond the door. Daniel reached for the knob and twisted it hard. Locked. Of course it was. His training told him to stay calm, assess the situation. But this wasn't a routine call. This wasn't even real, was it? He had seen the girl, her black, empty eyes, her body twisting into something inhuman. His rational mind struggled to make sense of it. He raised his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer. I am trapped inside 417 Oak Hollow. Possible? He stopped himself from saying, supernatural. That would only make him sound insane. I need immediate backup. Silence. Then, static, warping, shifting, like something was listening. You shouldn't have come, Officer Mercer. His heart stopped. That voice, it was his own. Distorted. Wrong. The temperature dropped sharply, and his breath fogged in the dim light. The whispers returned, overlapping now, speaking in tongues he couldn't understand. The walls groaned, the wallpaper peeling back like something was trying to push through from the other side. Then, scratching. A slow, deliberate scrape of nails against wood. It came from the closet. Daniel's pulse pounded as he turned toward it. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only inky blackness beyond. The scratching grew more frantic, a desperate clawing sound, something wanted out. He took a slow step forward, then another. His fingers twitched over the holster of his gun, though deep down, he knew bullets wouldn't stop whatever was in there. A breathy sigh escaped from inside the closet. Let me out, Officer Mercer. The voice was not a child's anymore. It was deeper, raspier, something ancient, something hungry. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. His only option was forward. He reached for the closet door with a shaking hand, his palms slick with sweat. The moment his fingers touched the wood, a hand shot out. Long, bony fingers wrapped around his wrist with unnatural strength, their grip ice cold. Daniel cried out, yanking back, but the thing held him fast, its nails digging into his skin. Then it pulled. Daniel was yanked forward, his shoulder slamming against the closet frame. His flashlight spun wildly, illuminating a glimpse of what lay beyond the threshold. A hole, an impossible gaping void stretched inside the closet, deeper than the house, deeper than it had any right to be. Within the swirling blackness, shapes moved, twisting, shifting figures with too many limbs, too many eyes. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths. Daniel kicked hard, twisting his body, using every ounce of strength to break free. The grip loosened just enough, and he tore himself away, stumbling back. The closet door slammed shut on its own. The scratching stopped. The air in the room seemed to settle, but Daniel knew better. He needed to get out. He turned back to the door he had come through, gripping the knob with both hands. He twisted violently, but it refused to budge. Panic surged through his veins. Then the whispers returned. Not that way. He spun around. The girl was standing in the far corner again, her small frame trembling, her tangled hair obscuring her face. But this time, she was pointing. At the window. Daniel hesitated. The house was 2 stories up, and he had no idea what lay beneath. But staying here, that wasn't an option. Without wasting another second, he crossed the room and shoved the window open. A blast of freezing air hit him, making his breath catch. He looked down, nothing but dense fog below. He couldn't see the ground. "Hurry!" The girl's voice was small, urgent. The walls around him began to move. Shadows slithered like living things, stretching toward him, reaching. The voices grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of moans and distorted screams. No time to think. Daniel hoisted himself onto the ledge, gripping the edge tightly. His heart pounded as he steeled himself. Then, without another thought, he jumped. Cold air rushed past him as he plunged into the fog. And then, nothing. Silence. Darkness. Daniel awoke with a start, gasping for air. His body ached as if he had been hit by a truck. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus. Where was he? The fog had lifted. He was no longer in the house. Instead, he found himself lying on the pavement just outside 417 Oak Hollow Road. His cruiser was still parked nearby, headlights cutting through the night. The house loomed before him, just as decrepit and lifeless as before. But something was wrong. His radio crackled. "Unit 12, we received your distress call. Where are you?" Daniel fumbled for the radio. "I'm outside the house," he said, his voice hoarse. I don't know what happened. I was inside and then..." A pause. "Inside?" The dispatcher's voice was puzzled. "Officer Mercer, no one has been inside 417 Oak Hollow for over 15 years. Daniel felt his blood turn to ice. "That's not possible. I was just there. There was a girl..." "Negative. That house was condemned after a fire. No one has lived there since the Mitchell family perished. Are you sure you're at the right location?" A slow, sinking dread filled his stomach. Daniel turned to look back at the house, but it wasn't there. The lot was empty. Nothing but overgrown grass and remnants of a burned foundation remained. His breath hitched. He had been inside. He had seen the girl. He had felt something grab him. Hadn't he? Then, a child's giggle. Software, faint, right behind him. Officer Daniel Mercer's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the empty lot before him. His cruiser's headlights cast long shadows across the overgrown grass, illuminating only the charred remnants of a foundation long forgotten. But that wasn't possible. Just minutes ago, he had been inside 417 Oak Hollow. He had seen the peeling wallpaper, smelled the decay, felt something claw at him from the darkness. He had jumped from the second-story window to escape, so how was it that the house wasn't even here? His radio crackled again. "Unit 12, confirm your location. Are you experiencing distress?" Daniel hesitated before pressing the button. "Dispatch, I need confirmation on something. What happened to the house at 417 Oak Hollow?" A long pause. "The Mitchell residence?" "Yes," he said quickly. "What happened to it?" "Stand by." A hollow silence filled the air as Daniel waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. The wind rustled through the dead trees, whispering through the empty lot as if something unseen still lurked there, watching. Finally, the dispatcher's voice returned, but it was quieter now, cautious. 417 Oak Hollow burned down 15 years ago. The entire Mitchell family perished inside. Father, mother, and their 6-year-old daughter Lily. Official cause was an electrical fire, but there were rumors. Daniel swallowed hard. What kind of rumors? Another pause. Some folks claimed the family was involved in something unnatural. Neighbors said they heard screaming from inside the house weeks before the fire. Some believed the house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, that whatever lived inside never left. Daniel's fingers tightened around the radio. Then tell me, dispatch, if this house burned down 15 years ago, how the hell was I just inside it? The silence stretched too long this time. Unit 12, are you sure you're okay? Do you need medical assistance? Daniel shook his head, even though no one could see him. He was losing it. He had to be. Then, a shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. A child's silhouette. Small, still, standing at the edge of the empty lot just beyond the reach of his headlights. His breath hitched. Lily? The figure didn't move. Daniel took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against gravel. The night air pressed in around him, thick and oppressive. His instincts screamed at him to turn away, get in his cruiser, leave. But something kept him rooted in place, something familiar. Lily, he tried again, his voice softer now. Is that you? The child's head tilted slightly. The movement was unnatural, wrong, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. Then, in the dim glow of his headlights, Daniel whipped around, heart hammering, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But there was no one there, just the empty lot, the burned-out remains of a house that, if the dispatcher was to be believed, hadn't stood for over 15 years. But he had been inside, he had seen the girl, and now he had heard her again. His radio crackled. Unit 12, confirm your location. Do you require medical assistance? Daniel hesitated. His mind screamed at him to say yes, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something inside him, something raw and instinctual, told him he wasn't finished here. Negative, he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. I'm going to take another look around. A pause. Then, copy that, Unit 12, proceed with caution. Daniel secured his flashlight and scanned the lot. Weeds stretched up through cracked pavement, and remnants of charred wood jutted from the ground like skeletal remains. The house may have been gone, but the land itself felt wrong. A bitter wind swept through the air, and for a moment he swore he smelled smoke, old, acrid, like a fire long since extinguished, but never forgotten. And then he saw it. Half buried beneath the rubble was a rusted metal object. He knelt and pulled it free, dusting off the dirt. It was an old tricycle. Its red paint long faded, the handlebar bent out of shape. Daniel's pulse quickened. The girl. Had this been hers? A memory stirred, something distant, something he couldn't quite grasp. His hands felt numb as he turned the tricycle over, and that was when he saw it. Carved into the frame, nearly worn away with time, was a name. Lillian. Daniel's breath caught. The name felt familiar, like an echo from a dream. And then, the whispers returned. Daniel. The wind howled, but the sound beneath it was unmistakable. Voices, dozens of them, overlapping, pleading, calling his name. He turned sharply, scanning the darkness. Then, in the corner of his vision, movement. A figure stood at the far end of the lot, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Small, still, waiting. Lillian? He called out. The figure didn't move. Daniel stepped closer, his boots crunching against debris. The air was colder now, thick with something unseen. Every instinct told him to leave, to run, but he had already stepped too far into this nightmare to turn back. Lillian, I just want to help, he said, his voice careful, measured. I know you called me here. Tell me why. Finally, the figure moved, not walking, drifting, gliding toward him as if her feet never touched the ground. The flashlight flickered violently, and for the first time, Daniel saw her clearly. She was the same girl from the house, tangled hair, tattered nightgown, but now, up close, she looked wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent. Her limbs twitched with unnatural stiffness, as if she was struggling to hold herself together, and her eyes, those hollow black voids, were weeping. Not with tears, but with ash. Daniel's stomach twisted. "Lillian, what happened to you?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Instead, she pointed, not at him, at the ground beneath his feet. Daniel's breath hitched. Slowly, he directed his flashlight downward. At first, all he saw was dirt, weeds, and remnants of scorched earth. But then, his stomach dropped. Beneath his feet, the fainter ground had shifted. The weeds and debris gave way, revealing something beneath the soil. A hand. Charred, withered. Fingers curled in agony, and beside it, more, 2, 3, dozens. Daniel stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The realization struck him like a freight train. Bodies. This wasn't just a burned house. It was a graveyard. The whispers surged, overlapping into cries, screams, desperate pleas for release. The air pulsed with something heavy, something ancient. And then, Lillian stepped forward, her expression twisted in pain. Her lips moved again, and this time, Daniel heard her. He did this. Daniel's blood ran cold. "Who?" he whispered. Lillian's head snapped up, and her blackened eyes locked onto his. And then, from the shadows, a second figure emerged. Taller, broader, not a child, of a man. Dressed in burnt remains of clothing, his skin blackened and peeling, his mouth twisted in a jagged, empty grin. Daniel's flashlight flickered wildly. He recognized the uniform the man was wearing, a police uniform. The whispers stopped. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. And then, in a voice that did not belong to any living thing, the burned officer spoke. "You shouldn't have come back, Daniel." The flashlight died. Darkness consumed everything. A hand grabbed his shoulder, and Daniel screamed. Daniel's scream was swallowed by the abyss as the burned officer's hand clamped down on his shoulder. The grip was impossibly strong, like iron chains anchoring him in place. The stench of charred flesh and smoke filled his nostrils, making his stomach churn. The flashlight was dead. The world was darkness. "You shouldn't have come back, Daniel." The voice was guttural, a rasp scraping against reality itself. It wasn't just sound, it was inside his head, crawling under his skin like something alive. Daniel fought against the grip, twisting violently. He had to break free. His hand found his gun, and without thinking, he fired. The muzzle flash lit up the void for a split second, and in that fleeting moment, he saw them. The burned officer was not alone. Behind him, dozens of figures stood motionless, warped and blackened, their faces half melted, their eyes hollow sockets of agony. The bullet did nothing. The burned officer didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed, a deep, fractured sound, like firewood splitting in a dying flame. Then, the ground collapsed beneath Daniel. A force unseen yanked him downward, the weight of the dead dragging him into the earth itself. Cold, ashen soil filled his mouth, his lungs, his screams muffled as he plunged into the darkness below. And then, silence. When Daniel came to, he was no longer outside. The scent of smoke still lingered, but the air was stale, unmoving. His eyes adjusted to the dim glow of flickering candlelight. He was in a basement, the basement of a house that no longer existed. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up. The stone walls were covered in soot, streaks of blackened handprints smeared across them like desperate attempts to escape. His gut twisted. This wasn't just a basement. It was a tomb. And then he saw the bodies, rows of charred skeletons, their forms curled in agonized positions, as if they had died screaming. Some were small, too small. Children. Daniel staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell had happened here? Then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. He turned sharply. From the shadows of the basement, a figure stepped forward. Not the burned officer, someone else, a man in a police uniform. But this one was different. He was whole, no burns, no melted flesh. But Daniel knew. He recognized him. The old, faded photograph on the police station's memorial wall, the name engraved beneath it. Sheriff Thomas Grayson, a man who had died over 15 years ago, a man who had burned alive in this house. And yet, here he stood, waiting, watching. The truth beneath the ashes. Daniel's voice was hoarse. Sheriff Grayson? The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't be here, Mercer. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it felt like a blade against Daniel's throat. What is this place? Daniel asked, his breath shallow. What happened here? The sheriff's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. The same thing that will happen to you, he said. Daniel's blood ran ice cold. Then, the whispers returned. A rush of memories that were not his own flooded his mind. Images, flashes of fire, screams, a locked door, a child begging for help. Daniel clutched his head as the truth came crashing down. 15 years ago, this house had burned, not by accident. The doors had been locked from the outside, and Sheriff Grayson, a man sworn to protect, had let it happen. Daniel gasped, staggering backward. You killed them. The sheriff didn't move, didn't deny it. Some stains, he said. Don't wash away. Daniel's stomach twisted. This place... His voice was barely a whisper. They're still here, aren't they? Sheriff Grayson's smile faded. They don't forget, Mercer. The candlelight flickered violently, and then, from all around them, the charred dead began to move, creaking, crawling, rising. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He had to get out. Now Sheriff Grayson simply stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as if he had never been there. And then, the dead reached for Daniel. The fire rises. Daniel ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that if he stopped, he would never leave this place. The basement twisted unnaturally, corridors shifting, stretching, as if the house itself was alive, refusing to let him go. The whispers turned into screams. The walls began to burn. Flames erupted, consuming everything in their path. The fire was spreading fast, but it wasn't a normal fire. It didn't destroy the house. It brought it back. Through the flames, Daniel saw the house reforming, the walls knitting together, the furniture reappearing, as if time was reversing. The house was being reborn. And at the center of it all, Lillian stood watching. Daniel lunged forward. Lillian, come on, we have to get out of here. But she shook her head. You still don't understand, she said softly. The fire raged higher, the walls trembling. Daniel coughed, his lungs burning. Understand what? Lillian stepped closer, her black eyes gleaming. You're not here to save us, Officer Mercer. The flames surged, and then Daniel felt it. Something cold wrapped around his ankle, a hand rising from the ashes. Lillian's voice whispered in his ear, You were always meant to burn too. And before Daniel could scream, the fire consumed him. A wave of fire and darkness swallowed Daniel whole. The searing heat licked at his skin, yet a terrible coldness crawled deep into his bones. He gasped, struggling, but the hand around his ankle held tight, dragging him down. Lillian's voice whispered all around him. You were always meant to burn too. Daniel fought back. He kicked wildly, twisting, his hands clawing at the floor. Except it wasn't the floor anymore. Beneath him, the ground had dissolved, replaced by an endless abyss of blackened hands reaching from the void. They pulled, desperate, their fingers clawing at his uniform, his flesh, dragging him deeper into the forgotten place beneath the fire. And then, the faces emerged, charred, hollow-eyed, screaming without sound, the victims of the fire, the forgotten ones. Daniel thrashed violently, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. "Let me go!" he shouted, but the voices only grew louder. "It's not fair!" "We never got out. Why should you?" The heat and the cold blurred together, and for the first time, Daniel felt himself slipping. His vision swam, his limbs were heavy, his mind filled with the sounds of crackling fire and wailing children. This was it. He was going to die here, just like them, just like... No! Somewhere deep inside, something snapped. Daniel refused. With one last burst of strength, he wrenched himself free, ripping out of their grasp. He clawed his way upward, toward the light of the fire above, his hands finding purchase on what felt like wooden floorboards reforming beneath him. And then... he broke through. The house that wouldn't die. Gasping, Daniel staggered to his feet. The world shifted violently, the walls twisting, morphing as if reality itself was unstable. The house was rebuilding around him, the flames restoring it, not destroying it. A house that refused to stay dead. The burned wallpaper regrew like rotting flesh knitting itself back together. The shattered furniture reassembled, covered in soot and dust. And in the flickering firelight, the shadows of the past began to take form. Daniel wasn't alone. The hallways were full. Figures drifted forward, smoky remnants of what they once were. Mothers, fathers, children, their faces twisting between life and death, their eyes empty sockets that still remembered. And at the end of the hallway, Sheriff Thomas Grayson stood waiting, whole, alive, as if he had never burned. But Daniel knew better. "You can't escape, Mercer," the sheriff said, his voice calm, too calm. "You should have left this place alone." Daniel clenched his fists. "You let them die," he said. His voice trembled with anger, but it was steady. "You locked the doors. You made sure no one got out." Grayson's face didn't change. "And now they belong here, just like you will." The whispers swelled again, rising into a crescendo of rage and sorrow. The house shook violently. The victims were waking up. Grayson took a step forward. But this time, Daniel didn't move back. Instead, he reached for his gun, not to shoot, to light the final spark. The fire that set them free. With one swift motion, Daniel pulled his last flare from his belt. Grayson's expression finally changed. The sheriff's eyes darkened. "Don't!" Daniel struck the flare. A burst of red fire ignited in his hand, casting the room in a hellish glow. The shadows lurched backward, their whispers turning into shrieks. Daniel's hand trembled, but his resolve was iron. "If this house won't stay dead," he said, voice firm, "then I'll burn it to the ground myself." Grayson lunged for him. Daniel threw the flare. The moment it hit the floor, the fire exploded. A surge of flames roared to life, hungrily devouring the walls, the furniture, the very fabric of this cursed place. The house screamed. Grayson's face twisted in fury. "You think fire will kill me again?" he snarled. Daniel met his gaze, unwavering. "No," he said, "but it'll set them free." The flames rushed outward, consuming everything in their path, and then, for the first time, the forgotten ones fought back. From the inferno, Lillian stepped forward. Her dark eyes burned with something beyond hatred, beyond pain. She raised her hand, and the shadows around her obeyed. They surged toward Grayson, pulling him down, this time for good. The sheriff's screams were lost in the fire. Daniel ran. The house collapsed behind him, the past finally giving way to the present. And as he burst through the front door, the house crumbled into ash, ashes to ashes. The next morning, the lot was nothing but smoldering ruins. No sign of the house, no sign of the bodies, only ash. The fire department called it an unexplained gas explosion. The official report listed no casualties. And yet, Daniel knew better. As he stood at the edge of the burned lot, a whisper brushed against his ear. "Software, thank you." He turned sharply, but there was no one there, just the wind carrying away the last traces of a nightmare that had finally ended. Or so he hoped. The end.